Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, good morning. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Of course, a very warm welcome to the 2026 post-budget breakfast being hosted by the Standard Bank Group today. My name is Fifi Peters, and I am delighted to be spending the morning with you as we discuss the numbers and beyond. Minister of Finance of South Africa, sir. You are welcome, Deputy Minister of Finance, sir. Good morning. Also, executives of the Standard Bank Group as well. Great to have you in our company today. Representatives from National Treasury. We also have industry colleagues and captains I know, as well as my colleagues in the media industry and those who are joining online. Good morning to you. Minister, I can say that the team are very happy to have you here. Today we were having a reflection about this time last year, and suffice to say that we are happy that history has not repeated itself, sir. We meet, obviously, also, ladies and gentlemen, following quite concerning developments that happened at the weekend. And no, Kaizer Chiefs fans, I'm not talking about the results. But I am talking about, of course, what has happened in the Middle East, events that we are all following quite closely, I'm sure. Events that could have significant ramifications for humanity as well as our respective economies if not resolved. And in fact, as I was looking and as we all continue to pay attention to what's happening in the Middle East, sir, it actually echoed some of the calls that you made for South Africa to strengthen its resiliency and to really improve our buffers against some of the external shocks that are beyond our control. And I believe that this is one of the reasons that we have all come here this morning to discuss exactly how to do that, just to get into some of those levers that need to be pulled, the levers that can also be loosened to ensure that we're all able to grow this economy inclusively, efficiently, as well as sustainably for all. And so as you may have seen the program, we will be addressed by a number of speakers, but I'm equally looking forward to hearing your thoughts as audience members as well as your perspectives on how we can achieve the above and potentially more. But to kick off this morning's gathering, it is my great pleasure to welcome the Group CEO of the Standard Bank Group, of course, Mr. Sim Tshabalala, to deliver the opening remarks.
Thank you very, very much, Fifi. Mr. Minister, Mr. Deputy Minister, MEC Maila, I did see him a little bit earlier, DDGs Axelson and Modise, Chief Director Dlamini, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of all of us at Standard Bank, and in particular Luvuyo and Zen, our true boss, welcome to this event. We will have the great privilege of listening to the Minister, the Deputy Minister and DDGs in great detail shortly. So I won't stay up here for more than a couple of minutes. Let me just say this. I'm not just being polite in saying that it is an immense privilege to have a visit from the National Treasury team. It truly, truly is. If you'll forgive me a bad pun at this time of the morning, they truly are a national treasure. Recognized worldwide for their excellence, consistently ranked among the top 3 fiscal authorities globally, year after year after year, for budget transparency. They are deeply committed South Africans. They are trusted stewards of South Africa's resources, and they are unfailingly honorable in how they conduct themselves. These, incidentally, are 3 of Standard Bank's values, which is another way of saying that that is why we are so pleased to host the Minister, the Deputy Minister, the MEC, and the whole Treasury team. Based on what we at Standard Bank can see in our book, on what we can hear from our clients, and indeed based on the construction cranes all along Oxford Road, we agree with National Treasury that the South African economy is at a turning point. We're confident that better days are ahead, that the deficit will narrow, that the debt stock will fall, and that growth will accelerate. We also agree with the National Treasury, to quote the budget review, where they say that accelerating reforms in energy, logistics, and water, together with stronger state capability and more efficient infrastructure delivery, are essential to unlocking higher potential growth. We are absolutely delighted at the progress that has been made in Operation Vulindlela, we're pleased and frankly relieved that the Presidency and the Treasury have now both turned their attention to improving the performance of the municipalities. Stepping back from the details, what becomes clear is that a highly systematic program of structural reforms is being pursued with vigor. First, returning to fiscal orthodoxy and starting to build fiscal space. Second, restoring and expanding the large-scale infrastructure networks on which the economy so heavily depends. Third, rebuilding municipal capacity so important for the quality of life, for investor confidence, and the cost structure of small and medium enterprises. Minister, Deputy Minister, I know you're extremely busy people. I know that you're about to fly off to the United Kingdom, Minister. And I'm aware that what I'm about to say will require yet more very difficult and time-consuming activity. And I'm referring to interdepartmental coordination. Nevertheless, I would like to take this opportunity to suggest adding a fourth item to your agenda, the reform of business regulation in general. Let's bring back some of the 1990s ideas: regulatory impact analysis, regulatory process tracing, an emphasis on finding and cutting ancient and irrelevant red tape, a shift to a style of regulation making in which prolonged silence from regulators and policymakers can be taken as consent. This is a familiar playbook, but it is still one worth following. Reforms of this kind tend to face much less opposition than more dramatic changes. Yet cumulatively, they have large positive impacts, both on the pace of growth and on its consumption, by creating better conditions for smaller and more labor-intensive businesses. With that, with sincere gratitude for all the reforms that you've already achieved, and with apologies for not being able to resist the opportunity for a little bit of extra lobbying, they do say there is no free breakfast. We're looking forward to hearing from you, Minister. Over to you, Deputy Minister. Thank you.
The Minister of Finance suggests that I need a chair to stand on. He might not be wrong. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Chairperson, of course, the CEO of Standard Bank and the leadership of Standard Bank, distinguished guests, colleagues from the National Treasury. It's my privilege to join you this morning, almost a week after the budget. And in the immediate aftermath of the budget, when the Minister of Finance and I go around the country and deal with investors and financial institutions, in the immediate period, there's all the accolades. But a week after the budget, something uniquely honest happens, because the politics quiets, the applause fades, the headline settles, and then the real questions get asked. And the real questions always is, what does this mean for growth? What does this mean for investments? And what does this mean for confidence? And the national budget, at its core, ultimately is a credibility document. It tells the markets whether we understand the binding constraints in our economy. It attempts to demonstrate to business whether or not our policies are coherent, and it attempts to tell households whether government is serious about stability, all of which attempts to unlock confidence. And for the longest time, our fiscal narrative was dominated by deterioration. We had rising debt service costs, narrowing space for investment, and growing pressure on our social compact. But we are seeing the shifts in the last three budgets culminating in what we have achieved in this particular one. What we're beginning to see is an economy gaining traction. Obviously, we would like to go further and faster, but we are pulling every lever we can at the National Treasury. Reform momentum is beginning to become more visible. Investor confidence is stronger. Borrowing costs have declined, and macroeconomic stability, a necessary but not sufficient condition for faster growth, is becoming more entrenched. But these shifts don't happen by accident. It's as a consequence of consistent work in fiscal discipline, socializing it across the state, credible monetary policy decisions, and structural reforms that are beginning to unlock our supply-side constraints. And so we are beginning to see progress in stabilizing electricity supply. Of course, we still want to go much further on those reforms to get price stability as well. We're seeing improving freight rail performance. We're seeing simplified visa processes, advanced infrastructure reforms to bring in private capital and improve delivery. A lot of the changes we make don't always make headlines, but they do matter for growth. Because growth is not a slogan. It can become a slogan, of course, but for us, it's a function of risk and return. Because when macroeconomic credibility improves, our risk premium falls. And when the risk premiums fall, capital formation becomes more attractive. And when capital formation strengthens, employment follows. And if you looked in the detail of the budget, you'll see that after 2 years of decline, gross fixed capital formation begins to improve this year quite strongly. And that is why this is a turning point in our public finances. And I'm sure the minister will go into all the details on his work and his vision and stabilizing debt and how we got to this point. But let me say this, stabilization is not the destination, it's the platform. We're not trying to stabilize our way to prosperity. We know that we must grow there. And we know that growth requires more than fiscal prudence, and that's why we have the reform program through Operation Vulindlela. But there's also far more direct recognition that weaknesses in local governments can't be papered over indefinitely. And so we are putting in stronger interventions to address financial distress, improve accountability, and protect critical service delivery. And we are acutely aware that reform at the local level is not peripheral, it is now central to national growth. And that is why we have tabled things like the Metro Trading Services Reform Program and others. So, a stable macroeconomic framework creates confidence, a strong social foundation creates legitimacy, and the budget reflects our careful consideration of the pressure both firms and households have faced. And that balance, discipline and consolidation, without resorting to painful austerity, reform without instability, I think is what is providing markets with confidence. And confidence, as all of you know as bankers, is cumulative. It builds gradually, it compounds over time, and once entrenched, it reduces the cost of capital across the economy. And as we've seen in recent days, the global environment remains uncertain, our trade risks remain elevated, geopolitical tensions are accelerating, global capital flows are volatile, but countries that can demonstrate coherence and institutional seriousness in this time are better positioned to navigate that volatility. And what we are trying to do is entrench the credibility gains that we're seeing and to accelerate reform as much as we can. Government alone, of course, won't create the growth we need, and business alone cannot compensate for policy weaknesses. So the next phase of getting to growth will depend in partnership on particular infrastructure collaboration, on blended finance and innovation in capital markets, and of course on execution. So I want to thank Standard Bank and the broader financial sector for properly analyzing the detail of this budget and the critical role that you play in translating the policy stability and the macroeconomic environment that we create into investment momentum. And I'm sure that the Minister will outline the detailed path far more than I can with the specifics, but the overarching message I think this morning is simple. Our country is returning to credibility. We've stabilized our fiscus. We are becoming a less risky destination to invest in, and we're laying the foundations for faster growth. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you to you too, Deputy Finance Minister, for reminding us of some of the tangible results that we have seen across the financial markets, even in the economy, by way of the work that has been taking place by yourselves and the team behind the scenes. Notwithstanding what the currency is doing right now, we do know that, I read that most projections from some major institutions, including that of the Standard Bank Group, is posting for a rand to be stronger, notwithstanding what is happening right now. But to get into more details of the 2026 budget highlights, as the Deputy Finance Minister intimated, and also perhaps to also reflect on an old school playbook, sir. I think you'll agree that in fashion, old school has shown itself quite impactful, in music as well. It has shown itself quite meaningful, and so it'd be interesting to hear what you think about the old school playbook when it comes to regulation being meaningful to take this economy forward, sir. Thank you. Over to you, the Finance Minister of South Africa.
Program Director, Fifi. I was saying to Fifi, she has got an exclusive tender. Every time I come here, I find she's running. Deputy Minister, MC Maile is sitting there. Mr. Tshabalala, the Group CEO, CIB CEO, Luvuyo, distinguished guest. In 2022, I delivered the budget on the 23rd of February. I woke up on the 24th and went to the radio, the TV interview, SABC in the morning. I went back to the office. As I go to the office, Dr. Peters says, Minister, your numbers are gone. I say, why? He said, Russia has attacked Ukraine. I was excited, everybody saying I've delivered an outstanding and excellent budget. All of a sudden, the Americans attack Iran. My numbers are gone again. So that's the environment in which we operate. In crafting this budget, we told ourselves as something, a story that says, we need to craft a story for South Africans. What is that story? That story is that after COVID, you must understand some of the things which have had an impact on our public finances, the global financial crisis, the state capture, COVID, all of them have a cumulative effect in damaging our public finances. We're then reflecting during this period what has happened since then. That's the narrative we wanted to craft and said, we gave ourselves a task. I remember I took over the job 2 months before the medium-term budget policy statement in 2021. I was employed on the 5th of August, and 2021. We asked ourselves, since then, what have we said? What was the state of finances, and where are we today? And what are the things that we did in order to get there? Because it's not by sheer luck. That's the story we are telling, both in this speech and in the budget review. We kind of constructed a frame of reference that's going to guide us as we walk this journey. And said, these are the things that must guide us. The first one is macroeconomic stability. And we made it macroeconomic stability on its own is a necessary but insufficient condition for growth. So we need to do all other things in order to do that, to support this macroeconomic stability. And we gave us targets. We said by this financial year 25-26, we'll reach the peak of debt to GDP, and which will begin to decline. And some people are quibbling with us over the number. When we've reached the peak, but not at the number we had at the time. But the fact of the matter, our target was the year in which we reached the peak, not the number. And we've reached that peak. From now, we're quite confident we're beginning to see a decline. And that is manifesting itself and showing itself in terms of the debt service cost, the savings we're making over there. Understanding that on its own, macroeconomic stability is not is just a necessary but in insufficient condition. We needed to do structural reforms. Structural reforms were introduced by the Honorable Tito Mboweni. May his soul rest in peace. It was a strategic move on his part, and we carried through with that tradition, which are complementary to this structure, to this macroeconomic stability. As we're moving along, we're beginning to shift the composition of expenditure to go to another third element of our pillars, infrastructure spending. What we are debating now on infrastructure is not whether the amount is realistic. There are people who said, can you prove an hours? I don't know whether Edgar is in the room. I also said one time, Edgar, you're lying. Where is this 1 trillion? And Edgar just pulls his computer. He says, look, this is the amount, this for each sphere of government and for each state-owned organ of state. As we speak, 205 billion rand over the next 3 years is going to go to municipality. 69 billion rand is for the year 26-27. This financial year we're tabling. It's going to municipality and infrastructure. 74 billion rand to provinces. The question we're grappling with is how can we make sure that that money is spent efficiently and effectively? That's the battle what we're talking about in Treasury at the moment, and what institutional arrangements we need to put in place, and checks and balances we need to put in place that we can see the impact. That takes to another Sarah. Then that's why we talk about transforming the local government sphere. The local government sphere, we've got a problem at all levels of local government, at different, irrespective of size. The small ones, you've got a different problem. The small ones, you've got a deep problem. It's a capacity issue. Take engineers. We gave in municipalities such as in Bentley in 2024 money for disaster. As we're giving them in 2025, they've not spent the 2024 amount. Should we blame them? Yes and no. But out of the 38,000 engineers we have in South Africa now, 46% of them are in Gauteng. Yeah, in this part. We are not likely to see one in Bentley. Similar with a chartered accountant. So we have been doing what is, in my view, an unexpected kind of delivery mechanism, of thinking that people can deliver without necessary skills. In this regard, that's why we're making a proposition in the new division of revenue, where we say, in the case of municipalities that do not have capacity, one of several things are going to happen. One is either the district municipality, if it has got a capability. If both the municipality and the district don't have capability, unfortunately, we will have to use the national institutions for delivery of that infrastructure. For delivery of that infrastructure. So part of the problem we've had in municipalities as well, I hope Ms. Maile won't take issue with me on this. We've delved into Johannesburg and said, in Johannesburg, you pay your bill. Your bill does not say you are paying in this point for electricity, you are paying this point for water. You are paying one bill. What that means is that when Johannesburg Water collects, we collect about, in Johannesburg, 9 billion rand on water. Only 8 billion comes back into the water services. The 9 billion rands cross-subsidize other services. And therefore, it has got implications on the maintenance of that infrastructure. DM's focus, by the way, is local government. President forces us to give some, even if we don't want to give them some jobs. So DM Sarupen, one of his focus is local government. So he's running with these things. He thinks about it, dreams it. He's good. He's working with the World Bank in developing what is the Metro Trade Services in order to change this architecture of municipalities. So, in a nutshell, I said these are our 4 pillars. Let me touch on something which was important this year. The budget was smooth. He didn't leave me in the office this time, or whatever. The budget went smooth. It reflects a number of things that coalition governments are becoming a feature of the South African situation, and political parties have got to rise up to the occasion and realize that, and realize how to live in that environment. And I think all of us last year were a bit idealistic in how to manage each other. We learned lessons, everybody. It was impressive on Friday to listen to the EFF. The level of debate in the committee, also in the committee, was extraordinarily different. The EFF guy says politely, we now understand, we've never had the opportunity of thinking about amending the budget, which is fine. They should not have made the noise. They should have just said, okay, as Parliament, we vote against whatever your VAT, Mr. Minister. He says, now we understand our power in terms of the law, which last year, because it was new for political parties to be able to grapple with the question of amending the budget, we now know we have got the capability, and he said we're going to exercise that power. Right. It does not mean that, don't worry about instability because we'll have this battle and so on and so on. The Act says whatever they do, they must demonstrate macroeconomic stability. And they must also ensure that the fiscal framework is intact. So that's not a problem. It's the debate we need to have on the other issue I want to raise. We have stabilized, kind of anchored monetary policy by reducing inflation targeting, and there's clarity for everybody. That's the direction we're heading, at 3% inflation targeting. The debate we're having now is how do we make sure that we can provide that credibility and sustainability on the fiscal side. That's why we're throwing in the fiscal anchor debate as part of that. Part of the difficulty is going to be a political one than a technical one. Politicians are already arguing that you have made monetary policy a technical exercise. You want to make fiscal policy a technical exercise. It can't be right. We are elected by people who must have an area where we can exercise our right to make policy choices. In this regard, that's why we're crafting what I call a principled approach, which will not say there shall be this numerical target. No. The approach we're beginning to craft, there's Mr. Fiscal Anchors there. We sent him to Harvard, and he came back from Harvard drinking fiscal anchors and nothing else but fiscal anchor. Character. Now he's also organized the DM to be with him on fiscal anchors, and the DM has decided to do his PhD on fiscal rules. So the strategic thinking, by the way, like all politicians, I've been reluctant. I'm always dragged along, and I normally comply. I'm dragged along. The manner in which we are structuring it is something that says an administration that comes into place, as we did in 2024, has got to say what is going to be its rules for fiscal prudence. In other words, we're not putting a target for you, but you will design your own rules, but you will have fiscal prudence as an administration. Actually mean you will have a fiscal rule of some kind or a target of some kind. We do have a numerical figure now. Our numerical figure at the moment is the primary surplus. That's a unwritten, okay, not legislated, written because we say so, and we put it and we fight for it, and now this is the third consecutive year getting a primary surplus. Not written in law, but we try and fight for it. Because if we didn't do that, we would not be achieving the debt to GDP targets we're getting to now. So now we want to maintain this fiscal prudence route. As I'm about to sit down, because Fifi said everybody else, he doesn't trust me, so I should contain myself. So, moving forward now, we've got space to think about growth, which we're not going to be doing alone, we're going to be doing everybody else. We've got to think about what the Constitution enjoins us to do to progressively realize socio-economic rights. But we need growth to achieve that. There's been a positive, interesting review of the budget. I was telling Sim that I accidentally got into Gulam and Tim's document because what happened, sorry for Simon here, I was reading Simon's piece. And in Simon, he refers to macro team. When I click to the macro team, it gives me Gulam and the team. Long, interesting document. Sorry, Gulam. I got to a document. Quite a fascinating document. I was quoting that document now. Yuan Fori from the University of Stellenbosch, as I'm about to conclude, because I've got to deal with the small and medium enterprise issue. Yuan Fori, 2 days ago, he normally has his own piece as well. He published something like Latman does. Yuan Fori focuses on what he says. People have said everything about the budget, but they have not said about the firm and the small business. And he crafts some statements on tax, what we have said over the years, and what we have said about households and what we have said about firms and small business. He says for the first time, the ratio is small, 11 on households and 10 on businesses. And he goes on and on and on, outlining the impact of small businesses, more than I have thought. Now, if you ask me the regulatory framework, on my way here, I was talking to my colleague, the Minister of Small Business, about the same thing. I said, you must focus on the regulatory framework. Treasury's duty is to back you up. You must also start with government that are not paying people for 30 days as required by the PFMA. We start there. Because guys don't fight government because you won't get the next tender if you fight them for you to give them, to force them to pay you in 30 days now. So we've got to remove the regulatory framework. I kind of thought of a crazy idea. I said maybe the only way we can move faster is to appoint, who's this guy for a Free Market Foundation?
David and Sarah.
No.
Martin van Saden.
No, man. Leon. And you've got to create a shock in the system. If you bring somebody like Leon Lowe who's going to say, take all regulations on earth, so you start patching up what he's saying, but you need somebody who's going to create a shock in the system. We need a shock in the system in terms of regulation, even in government. GTEC in government has found that every accounting officer, which is the head of department, has got to produce 208 reports per annum, an average of 1 report per day. It can't be right. That is structural reforms that is going to happen in government, even in society, if the regulatory framework has got to be changed. Fifi, I've got 5 minutes for you. Thanks.
Oh, good. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. I think the minister actually gave the audience, yourselves, 5 minutes to engage further with any questions that you might have for this in conversation with National Treasury that we're about to have. And now I know who to pick in a game of 30 seconds. Winning guy, Sim, you're my guy. Thank you. Your guess, absolutely fantastic about the representative from the Free Market Foundation. And so I just wanted to say, impressive. I mean, you did that speech off the cuff. I mean, next time, this tablet, it phazamisayo when you do the budget, so you don't need it. You've just shown us that you don't need it, sir. Yeah. Suffice to say, MEC also of Gauteng, apologies, sir, I did not acknowledge you. Thank you so much. We are in your province after all, and we do appreciate your presence here, sir. And so let's turn to our in-conversation with National Treasury. Essentially, we'll be looking at budget highlights for 2026, just looking at the promises, looking at the delivery strategy, but also interrogating the room that the budget does make to invite private sector participation for a successful execution. And so to join me in this conversation, please, can you help welcome on stage with a warm applause, Ms. Boipuso Modise, the Head of Economic Policy and International Cooperation. She will be bringing a macroeconomic and global policy perspective shaping South Africa's growth strategy. We also have Mr. Keta Dlamini, Chief Director of Fiscal Policy, who will also bring the anchors of the fiscal framework, the debt trajectory, and sustainability on the numbers behind the budget. Take your seat, sir. Thank you. I think we can also know him as Mr. Harvard, we are told. And last but not least, we do have Ms. Hayley Reynolds, the Director of Corporate Income Taxes, who oversees tax policy, the architecture underpinning revenue, as well as competitiveness and certainty for business. You are all welcome. I guess quite a lot to discuss, but I am mindful of time, so not enough time nonetheless. But I am moved by your opening remarks, Minister, in terms of what you did say. The numbers are gone. And I'd like maybe a reaction from Treasury in terms of what that means by way of the numbers being gone. The budget, of course, representing an important turning point, and most of us have heard why it is an important turning point. But Boipuso, when you look at some of the global shocks that are happening right now, potential disappointments, how vulnerable is the budget that has been presented right now to events happening outside our shores? And should we be worried that the numbers are gone?
Morning, everyone. Thanks, Fifi. It was an interesting morning when the Minister of Finance tells you that your fiscal framework is off. But look, I mean, for a very long time, we've operated in an extremely uncertain environment. We know that we don't know a lot. And as a result, that means that you have to operate in a way that allows a certain amount of flexibility and a certain amount of trying to understand what the different options could be, given changes to the environment. Excuse me, for a long time now, I would say about 18 months, looking at the budget documentation, you'll note that we've increasingly emphasized external shocks to economic activity because our assessment has been, despite the very significant structural constraints that we faced for a very long time that were hamstringing growth, our view is that those shifts or those risks are shifting more to the global space. So to answer your question, we don't think the numbers are gone, but we do think that they sit a series of numbers that we need to be investigating. And to do that, what we do as an institution is present macroeconomic scenarios that go with the baseline that informs the macro fiscal framework. This year, we provided 2 scenarios that went with the framework, one looking at slightly stronger global growth and one looking at much weaker global growth and increased uncertainty. We're now living in a version of the world in which we're experiencing some of that, the extent of which remains to be seen. But we have those numbers. They are in the macro fiscal framework. They are also presented in Chapter 2 of the budget review. Strong recommend, please do read it. And that gives us a sense of what we think might happen. We also run those scenarios through the macro fiscal framework, which Keta can speak to. And I think on page 26, you said, we provide a sense of what that could mean for the macroeconomic framework. So, and the macro fiscal picture. So effectively, yes, whilst there's a lot of uncertainty, we've had to learn to be pretty agile in the way we think about things, and we present a view of what shocks could mean to economic activity and subsequently the fiscal framework, and that's also presented in the budget documentation.
But you know what? Thank you so much. Very encouraging words, and certainly someone who didn't AI her way through the budget. She can even quote the page in which she's making reference to, so we appreciate that. It's good to hear that there was planning, scenarios, best case, worst case, and Minister, I'm sure you are taking comfort in hearing from your team that we are relatively okay. Keta, I want to come to you because the Minister also spoke about the primary surplus now running in this country for around 3 years, and the expectation is that this is something that you want to maintain and continue as a Treasury. And I'm curious as to how you're thinking about that primary surplus and how big it needs to be to continue making a meaningful dent in our debt curve.
Okay. Well, firstly, thank you, Fifi, and thank you to the Standard Bank team for hosting us. So on page 26, we highlight 2 numbers. Firstly is what we think the debt stabilizing primary surplus will be. This year we're achieving 1.5%, and we expect that number to grow. And that is consistent with what we think the debt stabilizing primary surplus will be. And then over the long term, for the first time in a budget document, in fact, in any of our fiscal documents, we actually outline what we think the long-term path of the primary surplus will be, which is about, on average, 2.9%. We think that in a benign environment with the baseline as it was last week, but probably as it will continue, that is sufficient to not only stabilize the debt, and we've seen that that expectation has been anchored both within our documents, but also within the markets, but over the long term, actually begin to reduce debt as a share of GDP. So we're looking at a 2.9% surplus according to fiscal planning. That's a combination of what B has already discussed, scenario planning, but also the fact that long-term fiscal planning has adjusted to this world of low growth, but also a number of economic shocks, both domestic and global. And so we've realized that as we think about the fiscal framework, we also need to be building in these buffers so that if you look at the scenarios that B outlined, if you look at what happens in a lower growth world or where the macro numbers come in worse, what we demonstrate there is that we're still on track to stabilize debt, albeit at a higher level, but nevertheless, the fiscal framework is robust from that level. We can talk a bit more about the fiscal anchor, but essentially what the fiscal anchor, particularly this requirement of sustainability will entail is a demonstration of sustainability with a high degree of probability once we outline those specific proposals.
Okay, and hopefully we'll get into the dynamics a little bit further, but you can certainly tell that you have spent some time, quite a bit of time, in the US when Boipuso becomes B. Okay. So H, or Ms. Haley, there's a lot of business in this room. We heard from the chief exec of the Standard Bank Group speaking about some of the messaging from clients, a lot more optimism about what's going on in the economy right now, a lot more cranes out there that are being seen, and just pointing to a direction of growth for the economy, or a better direction of growth. For the business people who are in this room, what would you like them to take away as key highlights for the direction of tax policy in South Africa over the medium term?
Sure, thanks very much, Fifi, and thanks to everyone for hosting us this morning. So I think a lot has been said about growth being key to growing tax revenue. That's the most important thing for growing our tax base and ensuring that we have a sustainable revenue system so that we can spend on public services, etc. Also, we've tried to do a lot in the budget for savings and for small businesses in terms of lifting the voluntary registration threshold on VAT, for example, and that is really to try, in line with what Sim was saying earlier, to ease administrative complexity and allow businesses to get on with doing their businesses. For large businesses, of course, what is really important to us is that we ensure that the tax system is competitive internationally and that it's efficient. From a tax policy perspective and thinking about tax and how it impacts on business, it's often important to remind people, and I'm sure B or Boipuso will talk a little bit about OV and everything that's happening there, so that is really important for laying the ground and the foundation for businesses to operate in an economy if they have stable electricity, water, etc. Tax should be efficient. That is really one of the guiding principles in tax policy design for corporates. As much as possible, the tax system should actually get out of the way and allow businesses to invest and do what they do best. So that is really the guiding principles that drive tax policy. The budget has also mentioned, well, in his speech, the minister mentioned that raising taxes would be a last resort. So you've heard a lot about this as a turning point for South Africa, and if all goes well and in line with projections, of course, if we haven't lost all of the numbers, then we think that revenue should do well this year and that we won't necessarily need to increase taxes over the medium term. The budget has also spoken a bit about the tax burden in South Africa and recognised that it is high relative to other countries, so both for individuals and corporate tax and corporates. That is recognised. If you compare our personal income tax and corporate income tax to GDP ratios, we are on the high end of the spectrum. We do think that revenue from commodities might help us, but yeah, I would say that we're generally in a good position.
Can I stay with you? Just also acknowledging the high level of the tax burden for both the household and the business owner. And Minister, you made reference of the former finance minister, Minister Mweni, and I remember under his time we had fall in corporate tax for the first time in a long time. And I'm just wondering, there's a commitment not to raise taxes, but just how should we be thinking about signaling about, you know, your understanding of the tax burden and the potential for lowering of taxes, you know, just balancing the fiscal needs, but also with some of the needs for South Africa to remain in competitive international jurisdiction?
Sure. So it is important that we take a balanced approach, and that's an important part of the Treasury in making trade-offs in all the decisions that we make. So as Fifi mentioned, the corporate tax rate was reduced about 3 years ago. That, of course, was in conjunction with base broadening measures, so that it was ultimately meant to be revenue neutral. And the objective was really to move towards a more efficient tax system. We've seen globally how there's been a race to the bottom, and the global minimum tax has sort of tried to put a floor on that. But the objective really is to have a competitive system where businesses want to invest, they're not impeded from investing. In this year's budget, it was announced, for example, that one of the anti-avoidance rules for special economic zones is moving towards a transfer pricing, a more friendly approach for businesses. We've also done things for, it's also been announced, for example, that unlisted REITs will receive the same tax treatment as REITs, so in infrastructure investment, etc. That is also important. In terms of thinking about whether there's a potential to reduce taxes in future, of course, as I mentioned, growing the economy is key, and if we have a structural increase in corporate tax revenue, that could potentially cater for thinking along those lines. But of course, nothing, as we know, is certain, and anything in that regard would be announced by the minister.
All right. And so we do know that one of the levers that this government is using, and we have seen some results so far to help grow the economy, which is key in the words of Haley, is Operation Vulindlela OV. And just looking at Treasury's growth projections, some have said that you have gone on the more modest side of the curve, but notwithstanding, by way of the heavy lifting and by way of where you are seeing the most potential, what is it? You know, the energy reforms, the transport, you know, fixing the local government. How should we be looking at how you're seeing things?
Great question. It's a tricky one. But I'll take a step back to take a step forward, if you'll allow. So the way that we see it and the way that we've communicated our view of economic policy and the way we need to be thinking about it is that it's built on sort of 4 core pillars. Both the Deputy Minister and Minister spoke about them this morning. The first is macroeconomic stability. Our view is that that's foundational to economic growth, and we're starting to see the fruits of some of the hard yards that we've won over the past several years by staying the course on the macro front, both from a monetary and a fiscal policy perspective. The second is implementing reforms for competitiveness, particularly to the extent that they reduce the cost and increase the ease of doing business, and I'll come back to a couple of these in a moment. The third is looking at state capability to ensure that the state is able to provide the goods and services required to support economic activity, because that's critical, and we've seen that in real time over the past several years as structural constraints hamstrung growth for a very long time. And the final one are reforms in infrastructure delivery, as well as resources allocated towards infrastructure to ensure that from the public perspective, we're also ensuring that we're investing in the infrastructure that supports and crowds in economic activity and investment, not just in the public, but also in the private sector. Looking at the reforms that we think are important for economic activity, look, the short answer is all of them. The elegant answer is, if you look at the reforms that have been selected under Operation Vulindlela, it is a subset of a broader set of government reforms, and that subset is very intentional in the way that it's been selected. Those reforms tend to be primarily in network industries that facilitate economic activity, in energy, in logistics, in visa reform, from a skills perspective, but also from a tourism perspective, in water and sanitation, and I'm forgetting a fifth. Digital transformation. There we go. Yeah. All of these things critical for economic activity. So when we think about them happening in tandem, and we think about them happening in a way that is catalytic for economic activity. What we've done over the past several years, and I think this is probably the first exception in quite some time, is that we present scenarios that we spoke about earlier, and historically what we would have done, and what we have done consistently, is provide upside scenarios that reflect what the combined effort of those reforms could be for economic activity. The reason we do it that way is because our view is that it's critically important that you think about them sort of from a big bang approach, and that's a big part of the way that we're thinking about reform implementation. These things work together and they work with purpose. In 2023, the very kind people of Standard Bank invited me here as well and asked a similar question. Gulam specifically asked a question about reform implementation, but then he sort of threw in a curveball and said, and as a result, what are you guys thinking about local government, which at the time seemed a little bit bewildering. But lo and behold, your skills as a prophet or your skills in prophecy are quite sharp, in the sense that in the second phase of Operation Vulindlela, we are now looking at expanding those reform areas from the initial 5 to include local government, including specific interventions in metro trading services, but also looking at digital infrastructure to the extent that we're seeing the world move in a particular direction, which has implications for productivity and our ability to participate in a changing global economy, and as well as other reforms that improve local government and improve the ability of local government to provide critical economic services. So my apology, a lengthy response, but the short answer, all of them important, and they work together in part of this broader context of 4 pillars.
Great answer, by the way.
Thank you kindly.
And so to move on, and I'm glad that you mentioned the digital transformation and some of the infrastructure that you guys are doing. I was quite excited when I heard about data centers here in South Africa and what the plans were. And I think that I'm looking forward to hearing what the private sector is thinking about their role and their involvement in capacitating our country from a data center and an increase in digital infrastructure point of view. But before we get there, Mr. Harvard, I want to come back to you on the fiscal anchor and just a really fairly ABC question on exactly how it's going to work. So the minister essentially told us that each respective government will be able to decide their own rules. So there's not going to be a dictatorship, but provided that the destination is, fiscal prudence and sustainability. And I'm just curious. So, the next government happens to think that, raising value-added tax is a fantastic idea to get towards that destination, and perhaps other incumbents in the government, if we're still operating under a GNU ecosystem, say no. So practically, can you just speak to us about how this fiscal anchor will work, will be decided on, and how binding it will be?
Okay. So we outline the principles-based approach to the fiscal anchor, and that's building on the discussion document that was published last year already, around what are the options we have in the design of the fiscal rule. And then that builds from a couple of insights about South Africa. It builds from the first insight that, fiscal policy is governed by the rule of law in South Africa. Hence, there was this debate about the fiscal framework last year because the Money Bills Amendment Act has a particular approach to the approval of the fiscal framework. And if that's not acceptable in the House, then a sequence of events unfold. So we build on that recognition. By the way, there's governance in the Constitution as well as the PFMA. The PFMA is a platform for strong procedural rules around fiscal policy, and so exists as already a fiscal responsibility law. We are thinking of strengthening that particular piece of legislation in all of the rules that govern fiscal policy. In the book, we outline the principle being, the first one is a commitment to sustainability. Essentially, a government, any administration that comes in, will have to table a fiscal plan. That fiscal plan will bind the government. It won't bind future governments. They may choose to continue that fiscal plan. If it's a good fiscal plan, they probably should. But they will always have a requirement for sustainability. And that is demonstrating to Parliament that ultimately the fiscal framework that they're tabling is sustainable. What does that mean? It means that over the long term, you're not financing government spending in a way that's overly reliant on debt or unorthodox experiments in economic policy. You have to demonstrate that it's ultimately your fiscal frameworks preserve the socioeconomic rights in line with the Constitution. So that's the thinking. There's a commitment to sustainability, but also then there's allowance for discretion for a government to table fiscal rules and fiscal targets, and we think it would be good for future governments to table fiscal targets that ultimately strengthen the health of the public finances. This is building on some insights we had from private sector workshops, where not only was the focus on debt sustainability, but also then they've looked at the quality of spending, the emphasis on capital spending as well. And so a future government may, for example, want to emphasize those themes as well as they table their fiscal plan.
All right. No, it will certainly be interesting to see how it unfolds. And Deputy Minister, so it's certainly interesting to see the completion of your PhD on the subject as well, to see what that looks like. So I'm going to ask one last question before I open it up to the floor, to opine, also pose questions. And Haley, it's just a doomsday scenario in the sense that growth undershoots in terms of initial forecasts, albeit conservative forecasts by some people's accounts. Growth undershoots because of X, Y, Z that is perhaps beyond our control. Perhaps it's an own goal that we have scored. Where in this scenario is Treasury likely to look for additional revenue? And what is the current standing on the wealth tax?
Sure. As stated in the budget review, and I mentioned it earlier, it's been acknowledged that the corporate and personal income tax to GDP ratios are quite high. From just looking at the personal income tax base, it funds almost 40% of total tax revenue. That is quite a lot. So it's important to frame the wealth tax in a bigger picture. We've had a lot of calls for a wealth tax, which you'll all be aware of. if you look at South Africa, doesn't have a specific tax that is labeled a wealth tax, but we do have about 4 taxes in our system that target wealth. So if you think about securities transfer tax, transfer duty, and the other 2 are escaping me now. But they together, estate duty is the one, together they collect just over 1% of GDP. And if you compare that with OECD countries, it's actually quite favorable. Their average is at about 0.5%. So we've also seen from international examples, so there are about 4 or 5 countries in the world that have a wealth tax, and we've seen that they are very difficult and complex to administer, and the revenue that they're able to raise is actually not that high. So in a response to a parliamentary question last year, the minister made all of these points, and also added that the personal income tax system as it is highly progressive. If you consider that there are about 650,000 personal income taxpayers that contribute half of all personal income tax revenue, that's 1% of the population. So there's also, of course, if you consider introducing a wealth tax, a risk that some of those people might leave, so you might actually end up losing revenue. So that is, the view on wealth taxes. And in terms of thinking about revenue more generally, we've seen that if large revenue increases are required, like what happened with VAT last year, it is very important that there is consultation, that people understand what the tax options are, and so that everyone is on the same page. So we would have to think about all the revenue-raising instruments in terms of what would make the most sense.
Okay, so just to confirm I've heard you correctly, so the wealthy that may or may not be in the room are off the hook in terms of potential wealth.
I think I'll hand
tax.
that to the minister.
Okay, and he'll obviously is free to comment on that. A good move. But are there any questions at this stage from the audience? Yes, so we see your hand, and I also see a hand there at the back. Can you actually keep them up? I do believe that there is a roving mic that is going around, just so we can see you. Let's try keep them as brief as is possible to allow as many people to ask as is possible.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Minister and the team, for coming through. Just a quick one from myself. Maybe I think the minister, referred to the efficient and effective expenditure. So I just wanted to find out to say, are we at a point where we will say the PFMA SCM framework in its current form has become a hindrance to infrastructure development? Should we get to the point where we relook at that legislation? And I think when we go check the dipstick for fear, which is the surrenders, which is basically an indication that people are scared to work and those that want to still continue to steal. So maybe that's, I think, the view to say, are we at the point where we really maybe need to relook at the SCM framework? And number 2, have we reached a point where we need to reassess in terms of the regulation impact of the taxes? Are we at a point where they're changing behavior so much that it's a cause for concern? Thank you.
And that's something we were discussing yesterday in the prep call by way of some of the behavioral taxes, the sugar tax, the carbon tax, whether it was changing behavior, but just jot that down. Any other questions at this stage? And I am mindful that the minister is in the room and he will definitely volunteer to answer any that he is open to, but I also know that he has fully capacitated his team on stage to do the answers as well. And so can I just ask that we direct questions to the experts from National Treasury who are in our company today. So any other questions? I saw a hand at the back there. No. Right.
Do I need to say my name?
Well, Destiny's Child did ask so. But,
Okay, my name is Modise Tsomutwening. I'm from Semaphore. I'm a journalist. I just have a question. I don't know if it's going to go to the minister or one of the experts in the panel. The question is that there was a newspaper report just a few weeks ago saying that about 0.1% of companies are paying 66% of corporate tax, and an aging demographic is propping up the personal income tax. So how does Treasury plan to mitigate this systemic risk of a single pillar revenue model if one sector, for example, were to fail, say mining or banking, were to experience a downturn? Thank you very much.
thank you. I think those are really good questions, but does anyone want to have a stack in going for any of them at this time? Okay, the Minister hasn't said. Essentially, there was a point made on the PFMA to what degree it is hindering, quality expenditure and perhaps even economic development. There's a point, Haley, which I think that, as I said, we were discussing yesterday, the behavioral taxes and where you are seeing tangible outcomes in that regard, and the small pool paying the large share of tax burden, and what this could potentially mean by risks of having this small small grouping, as it were, shouldering the burden.
So can I start with Siyabonga's question, also Treasury alumni?
Oh, right. Okay. So you get out and then you're like, yeah, I'm
and
going
now
to
suddenly,
get there.
Very clever. But, I think the infrastructure delivery ecosystem, and, we make a great deal of work or messaging around infrastructure in the budget review. Annexure D. Annexure D. And it's been incremental reform around infrastructure delivery, by the way, started by a Standard Bank alumni, Lungisa Fuzile.
Okay. Who's also in the room.
Probably. And
give him an applause.
And so, beginning with, for example, just reporting on the infrastructure pipeline, which began in his tenure, something that we've worked on quite a bit is the introduction of the BFI, the Budget Facility for Infrastructure, because we recognize that the MTEF and the infrastructure planning cycle don't necessarily always cohere to some of the reforms that we're outlining now in the budget review, where we're talking about strengthening the infrastructure delivery ecosystem as it relates to the infrastructure fund, the neighborhood partnership development grant, capital projects, and the Triple P unit. I mean, I think it's always been a point for us as the fiscal authorities that over time we continue to look at ways to strengthen the infrastructure delivery ecosystem, guided by evidence, but also then, as we think about the fiscal framework, which is what Parliament will be voting on in order to unlock the rest of the budget legislation, we also want a sound fiscal framework that demonstrates this ability to deliver on our capital improvement plans. So, for example, we talk about trends in underspending in the annexure, and you actually see that those trends in underspending are starting to come down as we start delivering on the reform agenda, particularly as it relates to public sector infrastructure delivery, and also making it more transparent. So it's always going to be incremental reform in order to get the fiscal framework more healthy from a capital payments perspective.
Okay. Yeah, you look like you've got something to say.
Great. Yeah, thank you. So a couple of things. I think Ket has covered it well from an infrastructure reform perspective. But I think that also happens in a context, and that context comes back to those 4 pillars I was speaking about. While legislative change is an important component of how we think about ensuring that our regulatory system is up to date in general, issues are broader than just regulatory, right? There are issues related to capability, there are issues related to capacity, and that speaks to the third pillar of the way that we think about our growth strategy more broadly. So these things are related, would be all I'd say to augment Keta's very comprehensive response. To the questions around taxation and the way that we think about it, a very small, the view is that there's a very small component of businesses contributing to the CIT pool and a very small component of households contributing to PIT. There are technical responses to it that Haley will likely speak to in relation to base broadening, but there is a more conceptual issue that I think is fundamental to the story of the South African economy, and that's about inclusivity. The reason we care about these 4 pillars and the reason that we are so, some would say, unimaginative in our continued reiteration of these 4 pillars of growth is that it's critically important that we build the economy sustainably and we do it in a way that's inclusive. We know, for instance, that in any given year, if we think about GDP broken down by component from a real GDP perspective, at least 60% of it is household consumption expenditure. If you break down household consumption expenditure, its key driver is disposable income primarily from wages. that tells us something about the importance of employment. So to the extent that you've got a PIT issue, you fundamentally need to be thinking about how you're creating an environment in which you're able to invest and employ in order to grow in a sustainable way, which is why, again, we've been so consistent in this growth story being a critical component of the fiscal story. Some people might say, and some people have said historically, you need to think about the fiscal story, get it right, and think about the growth story and get it right. And what we've been arguing for a very long time is that it's the same story. Fiscal policy is a component of the economic growth story, and economic growth feeds back into the fiscal growth story. These things work symbiotically, and our job is to ensure that we're pushing all of these levers simultaneously. To the excellent question that you asked around what's most important, they work together, and we need to be thinking about them in that way because they happen in this broader context of inclusivity that we are driving towards. So sorry, a bit of a lengthy response to your question, but I think it's a complicated question in some ways.
Okay, no, thank you so much for that. Haley, do you want to maybe opine on some of the technicals on broadening the tax base, but also the behavioral taxes and how effective they've been? I mean, made reference in your speech about some of the sin taxes, how it has led to this increase in the illicit economy. We do know one of the major companies within the space has rethought how it does business in this country, and that has ramifications for your fiscus as well as for jobs.
Sure. So B gave a great introduction to the question on the small tax base and concentrated tax base. That is something, of course, that we are aware of, and a lot of the points that she made are critical. That has been the focus of this budget, is really to drive growth, because that's a natural way to increase your tax base. Of course, what is also known is that any increases in tax have a negative impact on growth. So again, repeating what the minister said, there's no desire to increase taxes, and raising them should be a last resort, particularly over the medium term. We recognize also that in both the corporate and personal income tax space, that the financial sector is the largest contributor, and so there are sectors of the economy that contribute more than others. And then, of course, what's also very key from a tax policy design perspective is balancing where your revenue comes from. So the direct taxes, which are personal and corporate income taxes that are charged on income, relative to indirect taxes like VAT, which is a significant revenue base, and with the rate of which is actually not high by international standards when you compare that to direct taxes. Of course, that's a more difficult tax to raise, as we discovered last year. And then another important design element is the consideration of ensuring that tax bases are as broad as possible. So we like to talk about the cheese with holes in it. If you have a tax base that has a lot of exemptions and so on, it has a lot of holes. So you have to actually have a higher tax rate to raise the same amount of tax revenue. So those, but I would say that the key things are definitely what Boipuso pointed to. Those are key to ensuring sustainable revenue in the future. And then turning to the point on tax and driving behavioral change, I think it's key to point out at the outset that the primary objective of the tax system is to raise revenue. The tax system can be used for secondary objectives, and we do have some examples of that in South Africa. So we have examples of where individuals or companies are incentivized to do something that is positive. So, for example, there was a lot of focus in this budget and on the response to the budget of what it was done in the tax system, for example, to encourage savings by increasing thresholds, etc., for inflation. So to try and encourage individuals to save more. Of course, there are limits in which the tax system can be used to do that. So some people have asked, for example, why weren't the thresholds increased more for the tax-free savings account? At a certain level, you also have to think that equity is an important principle. And so if you can save a certain amount of money, you probably don't need the tax system to help you to save more. So there are also those important balancing acts that are considered. The tax system can also be used to change behavior in a different way. So if we think of companies emitting carbon dioxide into the air and the health effects and so on that has on our society, the tax system can be used in the form of the carbon tax, for example, to discourage businesses from doing that and to really encourage them to invest in cleaner technologies that don't emit as much carbon dioxide. You mentioned what is known as the sin taxes and the challenges with the illicit economy. That is a big challenge. Of course, you want to discourage people from excessively buying cigarettes or alcohol, but and government is very well aware of the challenges of the illicit economy and the factory that you mentioned that closed down. So, of course, that is why it is important that SARS is well supported. It is important that they are efficient and adequately equipped to do what they need to do. Enforcement is really key in illicit activities. So there's an interagency working team that's led by the FIC that is dealing with a lot of these illicit activities, of course, which cigarette smuggling, etc., and counterfeits are a part of. So I hope that helps.
No, fantastic, and thank you so much for that comprehensive response. I mean, we are out of time, unfortunately, but fortunately we still have a roaming breakfast and networking session that will take place, and I hope that you are able to stay and engage with the respective officials for questions that were not answered. Oh, I have been given permission to, no, not as yet, yes. But I think just in closing, and briefly if you can, Boipuso, I mean, if we meet 1 year from now, touch wood, that the minister won't take away this tender of mine. But if we meet 1 year from now, I mean, what should success look like, everything remaining equal, regarding this budget?
It's been a morning of colorful questions. Such a good question. Look, I mean, I would say that the best marker of success in our line of business is, have we done the things we said we were going to do? If we were to say we've had a successful 12 months and we've had a successful implementation of the fiscal framework, could we sit down and quote to you the charts and graphs and pages that we've spoken to this morning and been able to make traction against them? And to the extent that we haven't, had very real and practical explanations as to why, and have a practical plan as to how we navigate the path going forward. But I think the simplest way to build confidence and to create the right foundations for success from a macro fiscal perspective is doing the things that we say we're going to do.
Sure. Delivering on those promises. Make that the last word. And many thanks to all of you. Engaging, very candid insights, and thank you also for shouldering some of the tough questions. Can I also ask the audience member just to help me thank our respective experts from National Treasury who joined us this morning. Thank you so much, and you may take your seats. We've got a couple of minutes left for this discussion, and really just to draw everything to a close for us and help us wrap things up. One last round of applause for the Chief Executive of Corporate and Investment Banking at the Standard Bank Group, Mr. Luvuyo Masinda.
Thank you very much, Fifi. Given your comments about Kaizer Chiefs, maybe this is your last one. Minister, maybe you won't see her again next year. To the Finance Minister, Mr. Enoch Godongwana, the Deputy Finance Minister, Mr. Sarupen, Mr. MC Maile, our National Treasury team, who truly are a national treasure, as Sim pointed out, our valued clients, Standard Bank colleagues, and Mr. Sim Tshabalala, Zen, Gamini, and the team who've helped put all of this together. And now that I've mentioned that, I think all protocol has been observed. The budget has taken place in an environment that is extremely volatile, as we've seen. And therefore, the need to build a resilient economy in our economy is more important than ever. A resilient SA economy needs to be designed around shock absorption, competitiveness, and institutional strengths. We are very encouraged, Mr. Minister, that the issues that are captured in the 4 themes that the budget focuses on and where we are seeing great progress addresses these needs. The issues of macroeconomic stability, the structural reforms, state capacity or dysfunction, infrastructure. However, we need more. I'm reminded of a book by Charles Dickens when Oliver Twist, having had his share of supper, looks at the chef and says, "Please, sir, I want some more." This is very familiar to me. Sim Tshabalala, no matter what we deliver, always ask for more. We're not asking for more indulgence, but more because what we have is not sufficient to achieve the goals that we've set. Those around reducing unemployment, eliminate extreme poverty, reduce inequality, and build a capable, ethical, developmental state. Our economy today feels similar. Stability is welcome. There is a strong foundation now for sustainable, faster growth. But stability alone is not enough to feed growth, employment, and investment. We need more reform, more execution, and more urgency. We look forward to see more done to diversify the economy to other sectors or industries, such as agro-processing, manufacturing niches. And in closing, given that Fifi already said we only have 2 minutes, on this issue of partnerships, I want to share to you directly, Minister, to the finance to the team from Treasury, and to our clients, that as Standard Bank, we stand ready to not only deploy our capital, but to partner in a really meaningful way. It is our submission that capital is not a constraint. We are ready to deploy our capital at scale. What we will require and continue to ask for in return is policy certainty, which we're starting to see, bankable projects as it relates to the issue of infrastructure, risk-sharing clarity, and execution discipline. I want to thank everyone. Thanks the finance team who chose to spend the time with us, our clients, and our colleagues. We are really encouraged. We are very confident about your budget, Chair. You referenced earlier this week that you received an 8 out of 10 for your budget from Alex Hogg. I believe Gulam Balim gave you a 7.5 out of 10. All this points to an A+. Well, I don't know in these days educations, but very, very powerful, and we are really encouraged. And again, want to reiterate our readiness to support and work and partner, both with yourselves and with all our clients, to really get this economy growing to 3% economic growth in the next 3 years. Thank you very much.
Overthinking her. I once lost a love to the ocean.